you're all au fait with the housekeeping now. But you are automatically muted, so you'll need to hover down on the bottom left to unmute yourselves. So you've either got that option for asking a question, or if you put questions into the chat box, we'll pick it up. Or if you can raise your hand. So you can either literally do that physically, or if you hover down over participants, see the list of participants, and you can click next to that and you can see how to raise your hand. We do record these sessions and we post them onto our Knowledge Hub afterwards. If anybody's got a problem with being recorded, let us know. You can turn your camera off. You can change your name if you'd rather. And just a final thing, if you automatically leave the meeting, if you accidentally leave the meeting, you can automatically rejoin by clicking the same link. Any issues, then you can always email one of us and contact us to get back on. So that's fantastic. I'll now hand over to Katrina. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and welcome everybody to our next session on seed production. And for those of you who joined us in the previous session, you'll recall that we looked at some basic botany and principles to give you some background knowledge to seed production. So myself and my colleague Claire, who's our horticulturalist at the Heritage Seed Library, we're going to be on hand to answer your questions. But my plan is really to build on and revisit some of those themes and look at how we can apply them to your planning for seed production. So you might already have decided what to grow, or you might be at the point at which you've already started sowing, or you might still be thinking about how you're going to use your growing space for seed production. So what we're going to be looking at this afternoon are the planning requirements to do that. So we're going to start looking at some of the main points that you need to consider when looking at annuals and biennials, and that includes inbreeders, outbreeders, partial in or outbreeders, to cover all of those requirements. Crop rotation, really important part of organic seed production. You may well already be using that if you're already growing for market, for example, but we'll be looking at some additional factors that particularly apply for crop rotation for seed production. We're then going to look at some of the space requirements, and that ties into the type of crop you're growing, the population size you need, and also the yield considerations that you'll be thinking about if you're scaling up your seed production. So whether you're growing for a small piece of land that you're putting aside to try out seed, whether you're integrating it with your other growing requirements if you're growing for market, or if you're looking to create a scaled up seed production across multiple crops, then hopefully all of these principles will help you in planning your growing year. Finally, the last bit of this session is going to be over to you. So we're going to make sure that you have the opportunity to talk about some seed crops that you're planning to grow or you want to know more about that we might not have covered in this session. As has been said, please don't be shy about putting questions in the chat box or getting us to pause to answer some questions. We'll do our best to keep an eye out on those for you. So let's kind of recap, but also think about what we need to consider for this session. We use the term annual, biennial, perennial. Just a reminder really that in terms of seed production, we use the term annual very loosely. So things like runner beans, peppers, technically they are perennials, but certainly in the UK climate and in terms of the way we plan our seed production, we deal with them as annuals. And if you're right at the start of this journey of seed saving, this group of inbreeding annuals, they are the easiest crops to begin with. And I'm talking here about tomatoes, peas, French beans. They've got perfect flowers. They will happily self-pollinate. In fact, something like a pea will self-pollinate before the flower has even opened. So you don't need to introduce pollinators. Cross-pollination is unlikely to occur, although there are some things that you still need to keep an eye out for. So for something like a French bean flower, for example, it can be attractive to bees, and sometimes you might find evidence of bees biting in, drilling into the back of a flower to access the nectar. There is a low risk of cross-pollination, in other words, of pollen being transferred from another variety to the French bean variety that you're planning to save the seed from. You can grow more than one variety because of the low risk of cross-pollination. And in terms of population sizes, well, inbreeding annuals don't really suffer from inbreeding depression. So once you've got that basic population size you need to keep that gene pool healthy for seed, and depending on how much you want to scale up, it's really pretty straightforward to grow these types of crops for seed. One thing to bear in mind is that seed yield can vary enormously within the same crop type. So although, for example, you only need about 6 tomato plants to ensure that the seed that you produce is genetically healthy in terms of population size, that might vary significantly depending on the yield that you're looking to harvest. So something like a beefsteak tomato, for example, will produce significantly fewer fruit and often very few seeds inside the fruit compared to something like a cherry tomato. So when you're planning those, you also need to bear that in mind. So know what your variety is before you decide to the crop requirements for that year. Something like a beefsteak might only produce a few grams of seed. Something like a more prolific tomato variety, you might get anywhere between 20 and 40 grams for the same number of plants. So something to bear in mind. The next group up, well, these are the partial inbreeders or outbreeding annuals. And within that group, we would include broad bean, pepper, lettuce, runner beans, and some of those exceptional tomato varieties, like the one down in the bottom right, where there is an exposed stigma. So these flowers are open, unlike the inbreeding annuals that we've just looked at. So there is a risk of cross-pollinating with another variety. Flower structures, the flower itself is perfect, but they're open. And for runner beans and broad beans, there's an extra step in this process of seed production to bear in mind. The flowers themselves are perfect, but they do need to be tripped to be set for seed. So broad beans don't necessarily need an insect to do that, but for something like a runner bean, they do need something to trip the flower itself. Often something as heavy as a heavy bee will be able to do that. And that's because the female parts of the flowers are hidden behind the keel petal with the male parts, and they actually need to be exposed in order to be able to pollinate the flowers. The mechanism there is to transfer that pollen onto a passing insect, and of course that's the important step in producing seed for those types. If you're only growing one variety of any of these partial inbreeder, outbreeder annuals, and you know that there are no other varieties being grown nearby, then that's fine. You can isolate them by distance. But the variability in those isolation distances are determined by what kind of crop type you've got. So to give you an idea of the range, something like a lettuce only need about 8 meters isolation distance from another flowering lettuce to make sure that that crop remains true to type. But for something like a broad bean, we're looking at least half a mile. So if you are going to isolate them with a physical barrier, you also need to consider pollination methods for some of these crops, like the runner bean and the broad bean. Lettuces and tomatoes, they will happily self-pollinate. We can hand pollinate things like peppers, and we mimic the pollination process, the tripping process for runner beans and broad beans by mimicking a bee by using paintbrushes in order to create that effect and transfer that pollen. Again, how much seed do you want to produce? Population sizes are moderate. They're going to be slightly larger than annual inbreeders. And to give you an idea of range, for lettuce, we would recommend 10 plants. For something like a broad bean or a runner bean, we're talking somewhere between 20 and 30 plants. And so slightly larger populations. But also you need to bear in mind your yield requirements. So 10 lettuce plants, fantastic. They're very prolific at producing seed, and depending on the variety and the conditions, you can get 50 to 150 grams worth of seed. For something like broad beans and runner beans, bear in mind their yield is going to be lower than something like a French bean, where you might only have 10 or 20 pods on a plant and maybe only 3 or 4 beans, broad bean seeds in a pod. So bearing those kind of differences in mind will help you plan which crops you're going to choose to grow and the requirements you need to have in order to produce sufficient quantities of seed. Third group are outbreeding annuals, and we're talking here crops such as radish, cucurbits, so squashes, melon, cucumber, and some of the wind pollinated crops like sweet corn or spinach, which we've got there on the bottom right hand side. So flower structures for these outbreeding annuals, well, they're either going to be perfect flowers, but they are self-incompatible. So something like a radish, they won't be able to self-pollinate, or they have imperfect flowers, and that could be that they have separate male and female flowers on the same plant, so something like a squash or a sweet corn, or they could have separate male and female plants, in this case something like the spinach. If you're growing more than one variety a year, then isolation is important for these. So these are outbreeders, they will cross-pollinate, and for something like squashes, for example, insects really do like to visit them. If you're not going to use, if you're going to use some kind of barrier around them, and that could be a polytunnel or a mesh cover, then you do need to also think about introducing pollinators. So this group is a next step up really from the previous types, and particularly if you've got wind pollinated crops like sweet corn or spinach, that isolation protection for those crops is going to be quite important, because that pollen will travel significant distances, and we're talking thousands of meters in those cases. Because they're outbreeders, they need a medium to large population size to prevent inbreeding depression. Cucurbits seem to be an exception to this. We can usually get away with around 6 plants to ensure a healthy population. Again, how much seed are you planning to grow? Once you've got over that line in terms of healthy gene pool for seed production, then you can scale that up to the amounts that you need. Bearing in mind, these are all open pollinated crops. As I mentioned in the previous session, each plant is going to be slightly genetically different from another. That's really important. It allows plants to adapt and allows them to adapt to your growing conditions as well. But with that comes a certain amount of variability. And this group of crops, these outbreeding annuals, are likely to show much more variation across the variety than the previous groups than inbreeders. So you're likely to have to remove more plants through selection and roguing that are going to be atypical of the variety that you're trying to save seed from. So if you remember those 2 key principles that I mentioned in the last session, in order to produce seed that's true to type, you need to do 2 things. You need to prevent cross-pollination, and you need to save seed only from the best examples by selecting and roguing out those that are atypical. And it's at this group that really kicks in terms of the methods that you need to use. And finally, we're looking at biennials. So there are outbreeders. We're looking at members of the brassica family, things like cabbage and kale, carrots, parsnips, beetroot, root crops like that, and allium family, so leeks and onions. So they're all outbreeders, and as outbreeders, they all need another flower to cross with in order to set seed. So for something like onions and brassicas, the flowers themselves are self-incompatible, so they need to transfer a pollen from one flower to another in order to produce that seed. And for something like onions and leeks, often that pollen is produced at a different time to where the stigma is receptive. So there's definite need to have a process that will allow that cross-pollination to happen within that particular variety. Because they're outbreeders, continuous inbreeding is going to result in inbreeding depression, and that's reflected in the population size. So they need a medium to larger population size. And to give you some idea of the range, top of the pile in terms of size requirements are going to be the brassicas, the biennial brassicas like kale and cabbage, and we're talking around 100 plants ideally, which you're saving seed, from which you're saving the seed. And for onions, that can come down to about 20 plants. So within that range, we're looking at a larger population size in terms of your planning. Obviously, as outbreeders, it also means that they can very easily cross-pollinate with other varieties. And the easiest way to avoid this, of course, is going to be growing on an isolated site. So, and growing just one crop. So if that's not possible, and if there's a likelihood of some kind of cross-pollination occurring, either from neighbouring crops or even from crop wild relatives for some of these crops, then plants need to be isolated in some other way. That could include growing them within polytunnels or undercover. Again, when that happens, you also need to consider the pollination process in order to produce the seed. So for something like beetroot and related crops, chard, mangels, for example, they are wind pollinated. So if you're growing them inside and you've got a population size that's adequate, just giving the plants a bit of a shake is going to be all you're going to need. But for other crops like the incompatible flower types, you're going to need to introduce pollinators. So you can see on that top right hand side, one of the key methods that we use to pollinate these types of crops are introduce pollinators, in this case blowflies. So we go to angler shops and we pick up them at maggot stage, we pupate them, we bring them into our polytunnels, and they pick up some of the pollination process for us. They're not highly effective. They're pretty efficient, not as efficient as bees, for example. In terms of a method to pollinate, where hand pollination is perhaps not very practical, there was another consideration to bring in. If another option is to hand pollinate with larger brushes. So for things like alliums, you can use brushes, and for carrots, for example, and bellifers, you can use broad brushes in order to transfer that pollen across. I'm going to pause there for a moment and just ask if there are any other questions so far. I'll take that as an, oh, hello.
With leeks, would you need, say, 20 the same as onions, or would you need more?
Yes, so in terms of population sizes, the more the better, to be perfectly honest. So if you can grow, and we're talking the final population, and we'll talk a little bit more about additional things you need to consider for biennials. But the final population, you would want to have at least 20, but the more the better. That will give you a healthier gene pool.
I've got a crop of leeks. I probably grew 70. I've probably eaten maybe 10 to 15. I was either going to pull them up and freeze them, but actually I could try seed saving them.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe.
Yeah, that would be certainly that sounds like a healthy population size. I think obviously, and in fact, I'll move on to the next slide as I continue to answer your question on this, because there are some additional things to consider. Obviously, for biennial seed production, you're talking about 2 years commitment to growing crops for seed, and they're going to have different cultivation stages. So the flowering and setting seed is going to happen into the 2nd year. And because they're outbreeders, they're going to be highly variable. So of that population size, so let's take your leeks, for example, you're going to be roguing out any leeks, or eating, might be one way of describing it, any leeks that you're not planning to grow on into the 2nd year for seed production. So if you've got some well-growing leeks, they are true to type to the variety that you're expecting to see. As you go along through the growing year, you're going to be selecting those. So these multiple cultivation stages for biennial crops are really important. And for something like leeks, and we'll look at crop rotation in a moment, keeping them in the ground over winter is an important consideration as well. So you're committing that growing space for 2 years for production of seed from leeks, whereas you might be treating different crops slightly differently. So with that 2-year commitment, you're also going to have greater exposure to pests and diseases, and they might affect the crop differently from the 1st year into the 2nd year. That does have an impact on the initial number of seed that you decide to grow from. So you're going to be starting off with a lot more leeks or onions in year 1 and end up with, if ideally 20, but it sounds as though you may well end up with more leeks than that for your second year. They require a bit more effort, biennials, but you're going to be rewarded with a lot more seed as a result. So again, there is a payoff for growing biennials. If that's what you're planning to use your space to do, then that will help make your decision on what you want to grow. Timings are important. So in terms of some crops, so things like root crops that you're going to actually remove the roots, so carrots and beetroot, for example, you want to be able to time these to be at the mature edible stage when you select and rogue them and potentially lift them from the soil. So you need to think about when you're going to sow for these. So if you, for carrots, for example, you want to be sowing them later in the year so that you get to that roguing and selection stage at the right time of year to lift the roots and be able to select them over winter. And over winter, they're going to need somewhere cool, they're going to need somewhere frost-free if you're taking them out of the ground, and you need to have suitable containers to be able to do that. We'll be covering biennials again. We'll keep revisiting this because it's quite an interesting crop if you want to do something slightly different and able to commit to 2 years of seed production for a single crop. And we'll look at some of the details of that further along the line as well. So, excuse me. Crop rotation. And that's really important for seed production. As I mentioned, we're an organic certified seed producer. So we follow crop rotation principles in order to ensure that we have, it's a fundamental part of the way we grow our crops organically. And those same principles apply if you're already using crop rotations for market garden produce, for example, but there are some additional things to plan for. They're going to be variable crop sizes. So we've just talked about first year into second year biennial. You need to consider that. That will affect space requirements and determine how much growing space you have. Not all of your growing areas that you're going to be using for rotation might be the same size or shape. If you have not yet started this process, this is a great opportunity to start from scratch and determine your growing spaces in a way that's going to work for multiple crops. So we've got our lovely illustration here on the right hand side of our outdoor growing spaces, and my colleague Claire does the crop rotation planning every year for about 100 crops that we grow for seed. Frankly, it's quite a bit of a nosebleed of an exercise to manage to fit them all in, all our crop requirements within the suitable crop rotation scheme. And we'll look at an example in a moment. So if you do have the opportunity to start this from scratch, we grow in an area where we've had historically different polytunnel sizes, different outdoor growing spaces, donated isolation fruit cages, and so forth. So our growing spaces are a bit of a hodgepodge when it comes to determining our growing plans for each year. You also, obviously, if you're going to be producing seed for quantity and for seed production purposes, you're going to be thinking about yield. So depending on what you're planning to grow and the likely yield you're going to get from it, as well as the healthy population size you need, that also needs to be factored into your crop rotation planning. And as we've just discussed, biennials will need to be fitted into a rotation scheme that reflects the fact that they've got different first and second year growing requirements. So a few key principles. Keep it as simple as possible, I think, and in various ways. That includes dividing up the space that you're going to be growing things in. And what you're trying to do, and this is what makes a crop rotation a good crop rotation, is you're trying to balance that removal of nutrients with building up nutrients in the ground, building up that fertility with the crops that you grow in sequence. So you might want to include a legume. We include green manures in this process. There are other factors like, are you going to be growing different root systems? So you might want to have a shallow root followed by a deep rooting crop. And all of this it's important that this rotation allows sufficient time to make sure that you don't build up pest and disease problems for specific similar crops. Let's have a look at an example crop rotation for seed. Like I say, you may well be quite familiar with it with your growing for produce. And the general principles are you group your rotation by grouping plant families together. So you've got your alliums, you've got your brassicas, your legumes, and your umbellifers type plants like carrots, for example. So with onions and with brassicas, the reason why we have a 4-year crop rotation is that these crops require a 4-year rotation to manage pest and disease issues. So those are the 2 key crops that you're working around when you're doing your crop rotation planning. The exception to this are things like, so you'll see, we'll give you some examples within this plot scheme, but things like kale and leeks. So you mentioned, Alex, that you're going to be leaving your leeks in the ground to overwinter into the 2nd year. For crops like leeks and kale, for example, lifting them and then retransplanting them somewhere else for their 2nd year is not the way that you're going to be practicing that for seed production. So you can see in, let's look at plot 3, for example, the kale will be in that crop rotation in year 1, but it will also remain in the ground. So selection and roguing will have continued. So you'll be bringing that 1st year population down to a smaller number, but hopefully above 100 or around 100 at harvest time into that 2nd year. And it's going to stay in that plot. However, if you look at carrots, for example, well, you're growing it in plot 2 in year 1, but because you're lifting the carrots, overwintering them elsewhere under cover and replanting them out, then you're going to move that crop rotation site for those carrots to somewhere else. We've also included green manures in these, and again, this is about adding nutrients back into the soil, adding content back into the soil to balance out nutrients that have been removed through the growing for seed. Again, that has to be accommodated into your crop rotation planning as well. Something like, for example, these are overwintering crops between the growing season. You do need to bear in mind that certain other crops, so something like a mustard, for example, is a brassica. So that also needs to be factored in if you're going to include that into your crop rotation planning. So, space requirements. These are other things that need to be considered when you look at crop rotation, growing for seed. And as a general rule of thumb, you're going to need more space for crops if you're going to be growing them for seed per plant. I mean, in theory, you could argue that things like tomatoes, peas, French beans, runner beans, you could grow them in the same size of growing space that you would grow for eating, but you are going to be growing them to full maturity for seed production. And the more space that you're able to give them, the better, really. So a key principle for producing things like pea seeds, where we've got illustrated here, is to ensure that they have enough space and enough air for the pods to dry out sufficiently. So the more space that you can create between your plants, and that can include thinning out some of the foliage as well, but the more you can space those plants further apart, the better, really, in terms of producing seed and ensuring that they've got sufficient space to dry out. For climbing plants like peas, French beans, where space is an issue, you can limit the height of the plants by cropping them at the top when they reach the top of their canes, if that's an issue. An extra space is needed growing upwards, so we've got a lettuce here on the right hand side, so you need to factor that in. These plants can grow with metre and a half, and we'll talk about supports and support structures in a moment, but that also needs to be beared in mind. If you're starting from scratch, this is a great opportunity for you to think about your growing spaces, particularly if you're thinking of investing in a polytunnel. Again, on site here at Ryton, we've got about 9 polytunnels, but they're all different shapes and sizes. We've had them donated, we've used them for specific projects, and they all range from the kind of low hoop systems to those with vertical sides. If you haven't yet got a polytunnel, but you're thinking of investing in one and you think you might be using it for seed production, I think our advice would definitely be to invest in a tunnel that has straight sides, at least for 1 metre height before the curve of the hoops on that polytunnel. If you can invest in other things like mesh sides and frost curtains and crop bars to help support the kind of growing structures that you need for seed, even better. So one of the things that Claire does every year in deciding where to locate her crops are not just related to the crop rotation requirements and the population sizes for these individual crops, but also the height of the polytunnels. So for something like a runner bean, we tend to be growing them down the middle of our polytunnels because of the height requirements, and often we're having to think about growing dwarf varieties or short pea varieties, for example, on the sides of the polytunnels. So again, in terms of planning your space, we're a big fan of polytunnels for seed production because they're very useful in isolating, keeping that long growing season. If you're thinking about that, then certainly that kind of structure would be better to invest in if you're going to go down that route. Plants do need really good air circulation inside polytunnels or growing outside. So like I say, it's a general rule. If you can create that space for those growing plants, then that would be really useful to produce much higher yielding, much more successful seed production. Biennials, again, they have a slightly different thing to consider, additional things to bear in mind, particularly the fact that individual plants are going to be much bigger in their second year, and so therefore they benefit from wider spacing. So if you take something like a biennial brassica, in the top picture there, some of these cabbage plants, when they grow into their second year, they're kind of small tree height. So you have to think about the space that they would require into their second year. And for something like a cabbage, we're talking at least 1 metre gap to ensure that there's sufficient space for them to grow, for you to access those plants, and in order for them to be able to produce seed and not suffer from a build-up of moisture or any other issues that might affect the success of producing that seed. Of course, you also need to think about crops that you might be hand pollinating, and for something like alliums, where you might be hand pollinating rather than introducing pollinators, or in fact things like broad beans or runner beans, think about the spacing requirements for pollination as well for these. So if you do need to get in amongst the crops because you're growing a broad bean under cover and you need to use a paintbrush to hand pollinate because you're keeping pollinators out, you do need to think about the practical space requirements for you to be able to get in and amongst your crops as well. If you've got wind pollinated crops, but it also affects insect pollinated, think about growing them in blocks. So you know the classic example probably of of growing sweet corn. You want to grow it in a nice block so that it can be pollinated. If you're far enough away from another pollinating another sweet corn, then you can allow that to happen outside. But if you're growing something inside under a polytunnel to isolate it, you also want to make sure that when you shake those plants to ensure that the pollen is transferred, you can do that easily, and growing those in a block will help to do that.
There's a few questions coming in, Katrina.
Oh, yeah, I'll pause a moment. Yeah, thank you.
Lauren, I don't know whether you want to ask the question yourself. Should we do?
Yeah, can do. I think
great.
someone else has asked it as well, but yeah, if you're growing in a polytunnel, which for isolation purposes, are you not then selecting for it to not grow as well outdoors, or not to be as cold hardy?
That's a very good point. So there's a couple of advantage of growing in a polytunnel. One is that you are allowing it to expand the growing period of time to ensure that you are able to get those crops to full maturity to grow. But you're quite right, you are creating an environment in which they're growing where they're not exposed to some of the elements. There's a balance to be struck, and for us, we try to strike that balance by having mesh sides on our polytunnels. So obviously the temperature is going to be higher. And in fact, on very hot growing seasons, that's been a massive problem for quality of pollen and plants dropping their flowers, where we've had a couple of very hot seasons. But we do try and open the polytunnel sides with mesh to keep the insects out in order to create that airflow to keep the temperature down to a more manageable state. But it's a fair point. Yes, you are growing crops then that will grow happily in polytunnels. The alternative to that, because some crops, and particularly things like brassicas, really don't like growing in polytunnels. They don't like that potential increase in temperature. And what we do is we grow them outside in mesh cages. So the previous image that you saw of the way we manage our crop rotation, and that footprint image of the different outdoor growing beds that we have, we adapt fruit cages. We set them up as isolation spaces and we cover them with a fine mesh. So we've got large walk-in fruit cages with mesh covers on them. And the idea of that is to create a more appropriate temperature range and also prevent buildup of condensation or any other issues that you might get in a polytunnel. But yes, you're right, and there's a balance to be struck there. But the important thing for us is also to make sure that we give these plants a suitable long growing season to produce the seed. And for us, it includes protecting it from wet weather at the end of the season, where we might be at risk of losing drying pods and things, for example.
Great, thanks. And John? Do you want to ask yours, or shall I? Or Sue?
Yeah, go on, John.
Sorry, John. I thought. Go on, you go first, John.
Obviously, a lot of market gardens set up for 750 wide or 1.2 metre wide beds, no dig beds. Do you use a different side of bed in order that you can widen the spacing? So you start small and then you rogue and then you leave them larger. Do you work on a particular size or length?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll invite Claire to jump in a moment. I suppose the way we kind of work our growing spaces based on the size of our polytunnels, fundamentally, because we've got limits on those sizes. And within each of those polytunnels, we have a unit of space, which is a bay, and a bay is about 2 metres by about 1.5 metres deep. So we're growing on quite a small scale to bear in mind. And essentially our growing plans are multiples of those bays. So we work to minimum requirements for a healthy gene pool. So we're trying to grow quite a lot of crops. We're growing 100 varieties, which is not necessarily what you would be doing for seed production. So once we've met those minimum population sizes we require, then they're going to be multiples of those bays. So to calculate that as an example, you need a minimum of 6 tomato plants in order to do that. We grow a minimum of 6. You're going to be considering much bigger quantities than that if you're going to be growing to scale. But we get 6 plants in a bay, 6 tomato plants in a bay. We'll get around 10 pea plants in a bay, but we might need 4 or 5 bays for 6 squash plants, for example. So we talk in those terms, in terms of what you're saying, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding your question, but you are going to be, if you're just dealing with annuals, then you need to think about the spacing for those crops by the time that you harvest them. If you're talking about roguing selection, you still need to, you don't know at that point which ones you're going to be roguing out, so you do still need to consider those dissimilar spacing. Claire, did you want to jump in and add anything to that, or was there a different direction?
No, I totally agree with that. The only thing I'd say is you've got an advantage with biennial crops that you store over winter, because you'll be planting them in a different area, so you can have a smaller spacing in the first year and then have a wider area in the second year, really, so that helps a little bit.
If setting up from new, would you recommend to have more of smaller polytunnels and cages to put the isolation rather than the traditional biggest one you can get normally for just growing for vegetables? Because then you've got to maybe even subdivide that.
Yeah, I suppose to give you an idea, so when we talk about a polytunnel, we might have about 12 or 15 different crops growing, or different varieties rather, growing in that polytunnel. So we use the polytunnels primarily for isolation. So we will put one runner bean, for example, in the polytunnel, but we might have 4 or 5 tomato varieties in the same tunnel, or 3 or 4 tomato types in that same polytunnel. So I suppose I would sort of turn that question around a little bit and say, how many crops are you planning to grow? Because one small polytunnel might be sufficient if you're only planning to grow one crop at a time. So you might go, actually, broad beans is my thing, and I need to isolate them in a polytunnel. Then you're going to grow just broad beans in that tunnel. But you obviously then need to make sure that you've got adequate alternative spaces for crop rotation, if that makes sense. Claire, did you want to add anything to that?
I suppose just if you're growing one crop in a polytunnel, so you've perhaps got a monoculture really, so it's quite nice to have a variety of vegetables, perhaps, if you want to go down that route.
I mean, in terms of size of polytunnels, that really is entirely up to you. If you have the space for a large polytunnel, of course, what that means is if you had 2 small polytunnels, you could potentially grow 2 smaller polytunnels on the same footprint. You could grow 2 varieties of broad beans at the same time, if that's what you wanted to do. Or you could, because you could only grow one isolated crop that requires isolation in a single polytunnel. So that might be another thing to consider. Are you planning just to grow for seed in your polytunnel, or are you planning to do multiple things? Are you planning to grow more than one crop in a space, or you're focusing just on one seed crop at a time?
They'll be growing food on site as well as the seed production. So just wondering whether to have rotate across 4 smaller polytunnels for the isolation, to keep the seed production in isolation. And as you say, have a few different crops in each one for the diversity, but then move it across a polytunnel for the next year. So maybe tomatoes and peppers, in one together, others in other ones, and try to keep it all isolated from the other crops which might grow outside.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, if you're going to be growing other crops for different purposes and not saving the seed from them, obviously if they're still going to reach a flowering stage, that you're going to need to isolate from the same type of crop that you might be growing for seed. So yeah, that's a really good idea, a way of managing that. And of course, if you're going to isolate these crops, also bear in mind, for some crops, you're going to have to introduce those pollinators. So again, you just need to factor in that planning. For the easy stuff that will happily self-pollinate, that's fine. If you've got the capacity to hand pollinate some crops, that's great. But you may well be thinking of introducing pollinators for those isolated crops in different ways. So all of those factors should help. But yeah, definitely, if you're growing some crops that will flower at the same time as crops that you're planning to grow for seed, then you do need to isolate them. And definitely polytunnels are a really good way of doing that for us.
That's great. Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina. Hi, Sue. Sue's got a question for you.
Hello, Sue.
Hi. Yeah, I got a bit confused last session about the mesh sizes, because you mentioned that, well, a standard mesh size, enviromesh size,
Yes,
would keep out most insects, would do for most things, but you mentioned a mesh size 0.2 by 0.8 millimeters. I couldn't find that anywhere. And did you say that would keep out some windborne pollen from spinach and that sort of thing?
Windborne pollen obviously is extremely fine, so we would probably want to include things like frost curtains at the point at which that pollen is happening, pollen is being released. So we want to try and minimise the risk of pollen being transferred by the wind, because it's very fine even with a fine mesh. But that will help a little bit for wind pollinated crops. In terms of, so are you saying you couldn't find a supplier of?
I couldn't see a supplier, no, anywhere for that size, because the fine enviromesh was 0.8 by 0.8.
Yeah. And that's fine for keeping visiting insects off, for example.
Yeah.
But for for us, for when we're covering our brassicas and keeping pests and diseases off our brassicas crops, for example, a much finer mesh is better for that. I think we use, well, I'm sure there are a range of suppliers. I know we have experienced difficulty sourcing supplies this year, no doubt as a consequence of increased interest in growing, possibly supply issues because of Brexit or the pandemic. So I know that at some point some supplies were out of stock. I think we use organisations like LBS Horticulture, for example. Is that right, Claire? Although obviously there are other, there are other commercial suppliers, so it might be worth shopping around. But I am aware that there have been some difficulties getting hold of these supplies. We're having a polytunnel refit at the moment, rebuilt at the moment, and there has been some delay on getting this mesh side requirement for our growing requirements. So it might be that there are difficulties, getting those.
So what size mesh would you use for brassicas then?
We would use the fine, the 0.2 size mesh, so the finest mesh possible for brassicas.
Okay.
Do you have anything to add to that, Claire, at all?
No, basically, I think that's correct, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would whitefly be a pollinator? Would brassica whitefly be a cross-pollinator, possibly?
Oh, right. So no, that's more of a pest issue.
That's a pest issue.
Yeah,
okay.
For the crop. Yeah, sorry if that wasn't very clear. Not as a pollination risk, but yeah, for whitefly for brassicas, trying to manage that. Yeah, with that size mesh. Yeah. Thank you, Sue.
Great, thank you. And then Naomi next. Sorry, I'm probably.
I think my question's been asked. It was about the polytunnel, similar to Lauren's question.
Oh,
So
brilliant. Lovely. Thanks, Naomi. Lisa?
Yeah, hi. I saw in one of the pictures you had grown some lettuce for seed in pots indoors.
Yeah.
How big would you need the pots, and how would you need to feed them, and how would you pollinate them?
Okay. Well, actually, let me move on to the next. Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of a different slide. I'll go back. Claire, do you want to answer that question while I return to the slide?
Yeah, so basically we grow them in a greenhouse because the seed heads are quite susceptible to rain. So it ensures, because they have very, I don't know if you can see from the photograph, but they have very feathery plumes around the seed. And if they're outside, they quite often rot. So that's the first reason why we've got them in pots in the greenhouse. We don't actually feed them. So we grow them in modules and then we keep potting them up. So they go into their final size. I'm trying to think what literage it is, and I can't think off the top of my head, but thinking about the size of the pot, it's not very scientific, but if it's sort of about 20 to 30 centimetres each side, because they're so large, I can't think of so basically quite a large pot, much bigger than 2 litres, so about 20 centimetres by 20 centimetres. And they need quite a lot of water as well when they're just about to flower. Another things to remember if you're growing them is that they're very susceptible to botrytis and mold. So to allow good air circulation and I don't know if you saw in the photograph that you could see the long seed stalk. Sometimes the lettuces keep their leaves on that seed stalk. So you need to remove the leaves as the seed stalk emerges so that it doesn't rot. And also because of the seed stalk can sort of go up to over 1 metre, to give the plant a really strong stake as well and support the seed stalk.
I've tried to bring up that slide. Apologies, it took me a moment to find it, but the slide, hopefully you can see the edge of the pots at least to give you some idea of the kind of capacity we're talking about. And as Claire says, removing of the leaves around the base to help with that process as well. And we'll be going on to, we'll cover the last slide in a moment about structural supports for these kinds of crops. And as Claire says, because they can grow to about a metre and a half, then having a strong firm cane into those pots at that point will help support that structure while it's growing.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant.
Lots of great questions. Kat is asking, could you possibly put the crop rotation slide back up for a second?
Of course.
And
This
I
one?
think Tilly was helping out with it, were you? Is that the...
Was that the slide you wanted?
Yes, is that help, Kat? I don't know whether Katie will be sharing this presentation anyway with you later. Well, is that usually and then I think we've got one more question from John, Katrina. I think that's the last of the questions then.
Great, thank you.
Oh, sorry, I've just realized what John's put. Do you have a larger, clearer image of your seed growing site layout?
Oh, goodness. What, this image here? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure you would necessarily want to copy it because it does reflect the quite remarkable amount of added on spaces we've done over the years. So if you can imagine, someone's donated a large fruit cage to us, so therefore we've lifted the turf and placed a new large fruit cage as part of our ability to expand that space. But yes, I'm sure we'd be happy to get you a clearer picture of that if we needed, if you would like that. But as I would definitely recommend, if you're doing this from scratch, even identical size polytunnels, identical height polytunnels, really helpful. Identical sized beds that can be easily divided up into crop rotation spaces. So as I mentioned, something like a 2 metre wide bay is fine for a tomato or a pea, but you need multiple of those for 6 squash plants. So even though you're only growing the same number of plants, actually the size requirement within a polytunnel or some covered space for some crops or outdoors for your growing requirements do need to accommodate all of those things. So even as spaces you can start off with, then you're going to be way ahead in terms of being able to manage crop rotations in a much easier way than Claire does her magic to actually create appropriate crop rotations that meet soil association standards for our seed production.
Great. And of course, thanks, Katie. Just as a reminder, this will be on the Tyfu Cymru Knowledge Hub afterwards if anybody wants to go back and have a look at anything that they've missed. Thank you. Thanks, Katrina.
That's quite all right. So if you can excuse there for all my flicking through the slides, I will just briefly cover the last section, which is about support structures. So looking at the kind of planning you might require for actually supporting the crops to grow for seed. You're going to be growing them a lot longer, so in exactly the same way as you need a bit more space for your crops, you also need to think about maybe some additional support for growing your crops. You're not going to be picking them necessarily for food production, so you've got this broad bean here. If you're going to grow that crop fully for seed, you don't want those plants falling over because they've got fantastic hand pollinating, or however you've decided to grow this crop. What you don't want is for it to be falling over to the ground with slugs eating your lovely green pods before they've had a chance to actually ripen up for seed. Again, good air circulation. As I mentioned before, if you're going to be hand pollinating, it's really helpful to have a system that allows you to get into those plants and support systems to keep the pods off the ground. So finally, some examples of the kind of support structures that we use for growing for seed. So you've got the carrots there on the left-hand side. Again, they need more space in their second year. So you're going to be growing, I don't know, potentially sowing hundreds of seeds in the first year to get your perfect examples of root shape and root colour and a typical phenotype information for that particular variety, in order for you to overwinter maybe 40, 50 roots, so that in the second year, accounting for any losses, you can plant out and end up saving seed from, say, 20, ideally more, carrot roots. They're going to produce these tall flower stalks, and we generally, most of our structures are based on cane and twine, so you can put canes within the growing seeds, flower heads, and then surround them with twine in order to stop those seed heads from drooping over, touching the ground, and potentially losing your crop. For things like almonds, for a leek, you might just need one cane per seed, per flower head. For something like onions, you might have a group that you support with a single cane. That next picture is beetroot. Again, you want to make sure you've spaced them out, but similarly, they will produce these very long drooping flower strands, which then are quite heavy. They will naturally drop to the floor. You want to be able to support them with canes and twine to keep them off the ground. It's also quite useful because if you're growing them inside a polytunnel, you're isolating them and they're wind pollinated, you want to give them a bit of a shake. And if you've got all of these twine and cane attached around this population of flowering beetroot, you know, you don't need to do quite so much work if they're all attached to each other and you're shaking the canes to get the pollen on them. And then finally, on the right hand side, this is one of our duties that we grow for seed. It's it's a kind of gourd plant. It's a prolific grower, but it's a good example of all the different factors you need to think about when you're growing for seed. Again, we only need 6 plants, but that took up 1.5 of a very big polytunnel because the space requirements were meters apart. We're growing for seed, so it's way beyond the edible phase that you would normally expect. In fact, for this particular variety, I think you're going to eat it, you would pick the fruit when it's about the size of a courgette. For seed production, you're going through its entire natural life cycle, and these grow to about the size of a small child. So you need, scaffolding to be able to sustain the weight of the fruit as it ripens. And in fact, by that stage, they were resting on upturned dustbins in order to support them. You might not be going for something quite so extreme, but it does help illustrate the point that when you're determining how to use your space, and if you're going to use a polytunnel, actually that's half the polytunnel that can't be assigned to other crops, and then you need to work that crop rotation into your future growing plans for those particular beds. So lots to think about, and like I said at the start of this session, you might already have a good idea of what you'll grow. You might already have your leeks in the ground, and that's not going to be an issue. You just need to know how to manage them. But for those of you at the very start of this journey, this is a great opportunity for you to think about all of these planning aspects in your seed growing year and help you decide what crops are best to start with and how they already fit in with your existing commercial enterprises or aspirations for producing seed. So I'm going to stop there, and it's been great to have lots of brilliant questions, so thank you very much. But this is also a discussion area for you guys as well, so happy to take more questions from you. There might be some crops that we haven't covered here that you want to talk about, or if you've got any other questions, feel free to ask us.
There's another one from Lisa, Katrina.
Hi Katrina. This year I grew some pumpkins for seed, and I stored them one in January, and the seeds inside were already growing. How do I avoid that?
It does happen, and we've had it with crops before. There is a balance. So when we grow squashes for seed, we will grow them to their ripe phase, but then when we crop them, we will take them inside and we will keep them for maybe another 2 or 3 weeks for them to harden up. And then it's at that point that we'll remove the seed. So if you do leave the seed in too long, they will start to germinate. And then you will find that when you've opened your pumpkin or your squash or whatever you're growing, that they will have already started to germinate. I'm wondering if temperature affects that as well. We normally keep, obviously we dry our fruit longer inside, so our squashes, we keep them at room temperature, But of course, at the moment we've extracted our seed, then we've dried them, and then we'll put them in cold store. So it might be that, you know, a combination of the being there for a long time, or where you might store them, might have affected that as well. Claire, did you have anything to add to that? I know we've had a few experiences in the past where we've had a few nasty surprises. And obviously, once they've started to germinate, then you can't store that seed, unfortunately.
Yeah. I don't know if you found, sometimes it's not the whole crop have started to germinate. So if you, I don't know if you found this, I don't know if you noticed if one squash started to germinate, whether all the others started. So sometimes if you've noticed that happening, you might be able to save the other crops at that point, at least try and have a look inside all of them and harvest the seed. Because I think we've had it with a doody, I think actually, Katrina,
Yeah.
and it wasn't every single doody, it was one or two doodies. And because they produced so much seed, we were actually okay, because the other ones were fine, they hadn't actually germinated. But yeah, we generally leave it for 2 weeks, I think, and then we do it just to be sure. And I think that the seeds should have reached their maximum viability by then. So there's no real reason for keeping them any longer, I don't think.
That's great. And thank you from Jeff, who says very informative session. And Maxwell's got a question.
Yeah, if we consider brassicas, and I've got a population of 100, they're outbreeders, as I understand it, so they'll be swapping genetic material before they form the seed. Am I committed to harvesting all 100 plants, or can I just grab the nearest few?
Yeah, so in terms of, obviously, the more seed you have, the more, you know, for future generations of seed sowing, the more variability, that's a good thing for that particular variety. But yes, in theory, what you're trying to do with the pollination at the pollination stage is making sure that there's enough genetic information across this population that can be transferred to these flowers. Because they're self-incompatible, they have to be pollinated by another flower, and ideally that's from another plant that's of the same variety. So, but once that process has happened, then obviously you're going to be generating potentially a huge amount of seed, and that's not what you want. But the important point is that they have cross-pollinated within that population. It's a suitable population. So, but I mean, I have to be honest, brassicas are really hard work for us at the Heritage Seed Library. If you've been successful enough to produce large quantities of seed, I definitely recommend that you harvest large quantities of seed, because it's really hard work. And if you've managed to produce a really successful crop, I'd harvest it all. Why not? But I can understand where you're coming from. Claire, did you want to add to anything to that?
Just to add to that. Sorry. Just to add to that, brassica seed keeps for 10 years or so. So you've got a long time to use it up as well. So.
Yeah, in fact, you know, I mean, I moan. Claire's too polite to moan about growing brassicas for seed, but they really are quite hard work. But as they are outbreeders, as you need such a large population size, at least you do have that added bonus of quite a long shelf life for that particular seed type. So as long as you keep that seed in good storage, cool and dry, you know, you're going to be of benefit to that. I think brassicas are probably some of the oldest seed that we've managed to germinate recently. So we had some dating back to about 1988, 89, something like that. To be honest, it originally had been frozen, and we obtained it and kept it in our cold store for a few years. But it's great stuff. It's very, you know, it keeps its viability for a long time. So if you can put the effort in, I'd definitely keep the seed. If necessary, even, you know, you could even freeze some of it if you wanted to do that. And as Claire says, it's got a very long shelf life. So, you know, you may never, ever, ever have to grow it for seed ever again. If that helps.
Thank you.
Sounds excellent. And Lisa has a question.
Sorry, I'm full of questions today.
That's great.
You started to touch on it, but is there like a table on how long seed keeps for different crops? Because I might want to grow some sort of more frequently than others.
Yes, and that's a really good point, because in fact all of our growing planning for seed production at the Heritage Seed Library is driven by the need to replenish the core library seed samples for each of our 800 heritage varieties that we maintain. And that's absolutely determined by the shelf life for each of the different vegetable types, and that will vary greatly for 1 or 2 years for a parsnip to 10 or so years for something like a brassica or a cucumber. You can find all of that information on the, so obviously we're part of Garden Organic, and the Garden Organic website does have the seed saving guidelines where we give the shelf life for each of the crops that we provide advice for. And I know that as part of the Tyfu Cymru programme, there'll be additional toolkit information, etc., for some of these crops. So yes, I direct you to the seed saving guidelines on the Garden Organic website for actual shelf life for different crop types. They're not in table form, but you can find that information against each of the individual crops.
Thank
Did
you.
you have a particular crop in mind that you were thinking of growing?
I've got quite a few crops I'm thinking of growing, but yeah, no, particularly I had grown some brassica seeds, and you were talking about brassica, and I was just wondering how long they lasted, because I did get a lot out of them, and I still have some of them, and it's about 5 years ago now. So
yeah, well, they could well be quite viable. So it depends how you want to use them, really. So for us, we grow for seed. We can afford the germination rate to drop off a bit because we'll just sow more seed. If we know it's older seed, we try and factor that into the risk factor of maintaining a particular variety, or if we're doing some trial varieties. If you're growing seed for distribution, if you're going to grow it for commercial exchange, then obviously you do need to make sure that the quality of that seed is high, and that includes the germination rate. But brassica is a good seed. If you can grow it well, if it's grown and you produce a healthy seed crop, you can keep that seed for a good length of time. You've said 5 years. I'd be very surprised if it's not viable, or at least a high proportion of it is not viable after 5 years, if you've kept it in good condition. So if you've kept it nice and dry, and if you've kept it cool, ideally, but most importantly dry, then you might find it's good. You can always germination test it, so you can always determine, and that's sometimes what we do with our older seed. If we're thinking about, well, actually we don't want to have to re-sow in a few weeks' time if we've got a low germination rate. For some of our more delicate seed that we know is quite old, we might pre-germinate it first as well. So that will give us an idea of risk in terms of how much seed we actually need to manage, but also means that we can oversow if we think we're going to have a low germination rate. So I think Claire, it's right. We've had to re-sow some alliums this year, some onions or leeks. That's reflected in the germination rate, but we know we've got more seed in the background in the cold store, so we're able to do that.
thank you, it's brilliant.
And Alex has got a question, and thank you, Lauren. There's a couple of links being put in the chat for people, so over to Alex.
My plot where I've got my crops is very close to a community allotment, but between me and the allotment there are a couple of houses and the lovely lady who lets me grow in her garden is surrounded by a conifer hedge. Would I need to worry about isolation because my trailer thought for crops to grow, because I've got them in the ground already, is broadbean or leek? Would I need to isolate them because I am so close to that community allotment?
So I suppose that the safe answer would be yes, but you have got a kind of barrier around your growing spaces. So you might want to be completely risk-free, in which case I would say you need to be at least half a mile away from the allotment, because someone is bound to be growing a broadbean on an allotment, and it is possible that insects will travel to do that. But they might be quite happy over there, and there might not be an issue with transferring pollen. The other option you could think about if you're growing something like a broadbean is to grow it in a block, so that you, I don't know, I think it's what, 64 or something like that, maybe not quite that many, but grow it in a block and only save the seed from the centre. So
yeah, I didn't think about that when I was sowing them. It's in a row, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. I mean, we're really risk averse at the Heritage Seed Library, because we're managing We're maintaining heritage varieties that have got very specific descriptions and history associated with them. We actually maintain multiple generations of seed just for that kind of scenario. So we won't discover that something's cross-pollinated until you re-sow that seed. And for a broad bean, no disrespect for the broad bean, but they can be quite broad beany. They can look quite similar compared to other crops where you've got very visible flower differences and things like that, very obvious differences. So you might not be able to tell quite so easily. So we're very, very risk averse. So we would definitely isolate our crops, and we would definitely keep multiple generations of seed. So if we did find a problem further down the line, and again, that might be something you might want to consider, is whether you have the capacity to leapfrog back in time to before there was a problem. And that's one of the ways that we manage our grow out. So for a broad bean variety, for example, we keep, I don't know, we keep the original donor seed just as reference, but it could be decades old. But then we might keep at least 3 generations of seed, so that we know that we can leapfrog back. In fact, usually more than that for something like an outbreeder, in order to make sure we've got a foolproof way of getting back to that original variety if there is a problem along the way. Broad beans are particularly tricky.
The variety I've sown is Aqua Dulce Claudia as well, so you know that's a very common variety. So then probably my leeks would be a safer option, because not many people would obviously let their leeks go to flower.
Yeah. So the only risk for leeks, well, not the only risk, and again we're very risk averse, but the risk for leeks are going to be that somebody's leeks go to seed that they're growing, you know, and that could be an environmental response. So when you're growing your leeks for seed, you're trying to manage that process very carefully so that they grow and they only flower and set seed in the second year. So we would rogue out any that have bolted effectively in the first year. We wouldn't want to keep those. But that's not to say that someone on the allotment has got a row of leek varieties that they're just growing to eat, but because of environmental issues, 1 or 2 of them have bolted. Well, there is a risk that an insect, a fly, has travelled to that leek, taken the pollen, is particularly fond of leeks, and goes and finds your flowers, and that cross-pollination has occurred as a result. It depends how, you know, are you growing for commercial seed production, or are you growing for your own?
Myself, but you know, down the line, it would be something I would contemplate for growing commercially. But you know, for the time being, it's experimenting, I suppose.
Well, and that experimenting is definitely going to be part of the learning process. So, you know, save that seed and see what it looks like when you grow it out next. You might find that there is some variability, and that will answer that question a little bit. But yeah, in terms of quality seed production, we have to, you know, it's something that we really work on quite hard at the seed library, because it's really hard to unpick retrospectively. And if you're dependent on that supply of seed, and you can't leapfrog back in time to find a pure, true to type version, then you know you will find it difficult to do that. And of course, with leeks, they're highly variable anyway, so you're going to have to make a judgment as to whether that off type was a result of cross-pollination, or whether it's the consequence of it being a very variable open outbreeder crop type as well. So there's a little bit of learning involved in that, and knowing your crop really well, and knowing what you're looking for. Another thing with broad beans that we recently discovered, which we found quite useful, although did unfortunately reveal a few issues for some of the varieties in our collection, was although the seed might look very consistent, that the hilum, the little belly button effectively on that seed, that is an indicator of whether it's cross-pollinated. So they should be a consistent colour within a particular variety, and that colour range will be from tan, sort of white, tan, brown, black, and there will be, you know, more dominant colours than others, I'm sure, but we look for a consistent colour, and often an indicator of cross-pollination is that the hilum colour is different across the seed. We'll tolerate 5 to 10% difference, but beyond that, then we would start to suspect that cross-pollination has occurred. And that's something we've relatively recently discovered.
Brilliant, thank you.
think that's all the questions at the moment, Katrina.
That's great.
Oh, sorry, one more from Johnny.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you know about Agretti and what the breeding characteristics are for Agretti.
I don't. Claire, have you got any?
I wonder if anybody knows.
No, we can go away and find out a bit more information for you, if that would help at all.
Yeah, we're thinking about doing it.
Okay. Sorry,
Yeah,
Kate, you look like you're going to say something.
I have actually grown it
for everyone,
but not to seed. So honestly, I wouldn't know. But yes, we could go away and have a look. It'd be interesting to find out, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
I've tried growing it for seed in a tunnel, and it did flower, and I hung it up and thought that it had died and it rotted. And then the next year, some Agretti seeds came up underneath where I'd hung it. So
yeah, that sounds very familiar. In fact, our biggest weed is on the heritage seed library, can often be something like a lettuce or a chard, you know, because we have slightly less traditional weeds in our polytunnels. So anything that will happily drop its seed, you may well find. But that's it. That indicates that you must have been doing something right with that process in order to be able to produce seed that unfortunately is now a weed in your growing space. But we'll get on it. Claire and I will have a look, and we'll perhaps, if we can post something back either through Katie or Sarah, so that can be shared with you, so that information gets back. But yeah, thank you. I think we had a question about quinoa last time, which we were able to come back with some growing, and that's helpful for us because it means we can expand our knowledge a little bit. So we need to learn too.
Great,
That's great. It sounds like Dee has grown it for seed as well. I don't know whether you've got any comments, Dee.
Yeah, I grew it for seed 3 years in a row, but actually not very methodically, not like doing any selection, just kind of letting kind of go to seed in like September and hanging all up. And then it does look like it's died, but actually if you peel it off and you see the little pods, they're like these little spiral pods. They do this is my internet's unstable. They do yeah, we've resown them with like 80% germination, which is much higher than when we bought them for seed, which was like 20% germination. But yeah, I'd be interested to know more about it as well, because it definitely we definitely like kept the crops that had done well, but I wonder about breeding like selection characteristics. They seem like, well, they look like quite a uniform crop, but yeah, we it's surprisingly easy to save the seed, but yeah, I'd be curious if there's more process you could do around it than what we were doing.
That's fine. Well, you've set us a bit of homework, so we can go away and make sure we come back with something that's useful. So that's really helpful actually for us, and we get an idea of what is of interest to grow for seed. So thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Dee. Okay. Are we over to Katie now, Katrina, or have you got more to go through?
I beg your pardon. So I'm done in terms of the sort of formal presentation. So really, it's over to any particular discussions. If Katie wants to lead on any particular questions, if we've covered all your questions, that's fantastic. If there are other specific crops or your planning requirements that you want to go over now, then that please do go ahead. Katie, did you want to lead on this, or you?
Lovely.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that was so much good information, and I feel like, yeah, again, loads of good things have come out in the discussion and the questions. I was going to give you guys a chance to talk to each other briefly about your seed crops that you want to grow this year, because yeah, it's just nice to be able to interact with each other and kind of process a little bit what you've learnt. So my idea for this part of the session is I emailed you all a seed exercise this afternoon, and I'm also going to put it in chat in case you email. And it's basically a document that just kind of allows you to write in some information about the seed crop that you want to grow this year. And there's some parts that I highlighted in green, which are kind of things that I thought you could discuss right. the idea of this is that you kind of are psychologically committing to what you're growing for seed this year. I mean, depending on what it is, you may have already sown it actually, and that's great. If you haven't, then this is the time to like psychologically commit to what you're going to grow for seed. So there's some questions seed exercise, like just kind of the things that Katrina's already covered. So like, is it an inbreeder or an outbreeder? How does it pollinate? What are your isolation techniques going to be? And like also thinking about its botanical name and its plant family and where it's going to fit into your rotation. And I just thought it'd be really helpful to put you into breakout rooms of like 4 people, and you just have a couple of minutes each to kind of share with each other what your plans are for your seed crop in terms of those things in green, like in terms of isolation distances and things like that, and cultivation techniques. And then to flag up any key questions that you still have about the seed crops that you're going to grow this year. And I know you've just asked a load of questions, so there might not be any more questions that come out of it. But if you all have a chance to share your plans, then it might be that like a few more questions come out. And this is obviously the perfect time to ask those questions, because we're like... So yeah, I'm going to put the link to the document in the chat again. And then I don't know if we need to have like a brief break. I think we should just go straight into this. No, forget the break. Let's just... So if Sarah wants to put us into breakout rooms of like 4 people, or maybe if it's an odd number, we'll have 3 or 5. And then within your group, you could get someone to be a timekeeper. So just to give you each like 2 to 3 minutes to talk about your crop. And then if you could allocate someone in your breakout room to be the person that records the questions that you can't answer within your group. So you're going to go around 2 to 3 minutes each, talk about the key things about your seed crop, and then the designated person is going to keep a note of anything you can't answer within the group. And then we'll come back together in like, so it's 23 minutes past 5. If we come back together at maybe in 15 minutes to give everybody 2 to 3 minutes to talk in the groups.
Okay, let's go for it.
Be invited to a room now.